for having me again. Thanks for having me again for the SARU. It's always a pleasure. Yes, as I was already introduced, warm welcome from me from Seoul, from Ewha Womans University, where I have been teaching international and comparative political economy, development cooperation, international organizations, and also for many years, actually, I've been teaching European integration and European Union. I've not been doing this for the last couple of semesters so much, so I'm very happy to talk about it a little bit today in the context of SARU and the context of German reunification and European integration process, and also what possible lessons could be learned from European integration and German reunification for East Asia. As a German scholar in being based in Korea, I think I can, even though this is not my main area of research, I think I can share some interesting thoughts on this, and I want to get into a discussion with you. So this is not about kind of some very original research of mine, and I'm not trying to prove anything to you here, but rather I hope I can give you some food for thought, maybe also create some kind of tension with the other presentations you received in during the summer school, and get into the discussion with me, but also maybe I can give you some food for thought that to ask to other lecturers at the SARU. Whenever you have understanding questions during my presentation, please do not hesitate to interrupt me. If you want to go into the discussion with me and with the others, then maybe you can write down your questions and ask them at the end. I think this is the best way. It's not so easy for me to have the overview of who is raising his or her hand, so while I'm doing the presentation. So please, I hope you understand that. And maybe if you have an urgent question, you can just unmute and interrupt me. That's not a problem. Okay, so let me share my PowerPoint that I prepared for you. And I hope I can limit myself to less than an hour, depending on how many questions there are within the presentation. And then we have half an hour time for the Q&A for discussions. Okay, let me go into full screen here. Yeah, so as I mentioned, and it's slightly, I took the liberty to slightly modify the title that is in the program. I would like to discuss with you my views on German reunification and regional integration in Europe, and what possible lessons there are for East Asia. And I know that, of course, you have heard about these topics before. So if I'm talking too much about things that you already know very well, then please also interrupt me and I can maybe go faster through this. And I think by now probably you have already learned that the European regional cooperation, or at least have discussed that the importance of European regional cooperation for the German reunification process. And you probably have heard that Germany, and this is of course a slight difference from Korea, needed the approval from the four allies of World War II, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France. And from my perspective, you know, one of the reasons why Germany got this approval relatively easy was because the European integration process helped to alleviate the concerns about a possible German dominance within Europe. And as you probably have also heard or already know, that has been in one of the big problems of Europe for many decades and centuries before, that Germany was at the center of Europe, the most populous country in Central Europe, etc. And there was always the kind of fear of Germany dominating the continent, and consequently there were always alliances to prevent against Germany to prevent such kind of dominance. And this, it's not a history lesson, so I don't think I don't need to go into detail here. I would say that if Germany was not so well integrated into the European Union, or at that time the European communities at the time of reunification, probably that concern would have been much, much bigger. It was there already, particularly by France, who was concerned about German dominance within the European communities, but it definitely helped. Another important aspect is, of course, that it was very attractive for East Germany to reunify with the West, and one reason was because the East Germany had immediate access to the European market. So unlike all the other Eastern European countries that needed to go to a very long process of negotiations to get admitted to the European Union or European communities, East Germany with reunification was immediately a member of the European Union. Also, the unification of Germany again had an effect on the further European integration. So German unification speeded up substantially EU integration. With the kind of the 1990s in Europe were very much, in the European Union, were very much occupied with the so-called Eastern enlargement, with the enlargement of the European Union to Eastern Europe. And as I already mentioned, the East Germany became member of the European single market, European communities with the reunification, but the other countries took much longer, 2004, and then finally Croatia in 2007 became member of the European Union. And as you might know, there are still quite a few Eastern European countries who are not yet member of the European Union, where there are still negotiations for admission. So becoming a member of the European Union is a very, very lengthy process of negotiation. This Eastern enlargement, again, of course, was very much, okay, what was that message? Can you see my presentation? I just got a message that you can see it. Okay, I don't know what that message was. And that again, this enlargement process of the European Union to Eastern Europe was very important for Germany, because Germany traditionally had very close economic ties with Eastern Europe, and at the same time, with the political negotiations of extending Europe, the European Union to Eastern Europe, was massive amount of investment from Western Europe and particularly from Germany into Eastern Europe. And many German companies and other Western European countries have opened up factories in Eastern Europe to exploit and take advantage of the lower labor costs and the excellent training, the excellent skills that existed among the labor force in Eastern Europe. Then finally, this is also probably that's something you have already heard about, the reunification, German reunification is very much linked to another very key important aspect of European integration, and that is the creation of the European Monetary Union, and finally the creation of the euro. So one of the originally Germany was not very much interested in creating a European Monetary Union, and we can later discuss this if you want to know more why this is the case. It was always France that wanted a European currency, a common European currency. Germany was always against it. With the reunification, France said, well, if you want our approval for German reunification, you have to also give us something. And one of the things was that Germany would give up its own currency that dominated currency markets in Europe before, and create a single European currency, which is the euro, which was created, finally came into force in 1999. So probably yesterday I couldn't join the session yesterday of my dear colleague Inhi Park, who is, as I know, a little bit more skeptical than me about the prospects of regional cooperation in East Asia and how much East Asia could actually learn from the European experience. So I try to kind of maybe also in this presentation to have a little bit a counterpoint to his more realist, pessimistic view of East Asia. And I would see it a little bit more optimistically, and let me explain a little bit more about this in the following slides. So I have basically 6 key lessons, I believe, that are important to learn from German reunification and European integration in Europe for East Asia. I'm not sure if I can get through all of them. I will try my best to do this within less than an hour. So my first lesson is I don't believe the pessimism of the realists, and actually many, and I would say this is the dominant feeling within East Asia, that a European Union style, European integration style cooperation, regional cooperation, multilateral, even supranational cooperation cannot work in East Asia because all of the historical reasons, etc., etc. And I'm not saying that these historical reasons don't exist. They do exist, but I think from my perspective, they maybe matter less than it is often seen in East Asia. And again, I'll explain more about this throughout the presentation. Second, I think this is an important lesson from the European Union. Multilateral institutions work and they can create their own dynamic of further cooperation. I think this is very important and a very important difference to East Asia, where bilateral cooperation is always at the center of international cooperation. But bilateral cooperation does not create, I would argue, the same kind of dynamic where cooperation in one area leads to cooperation in other areas too. And again, I'll talk more about this later. It is possible to go beyond nationalism. As you all probably know, East Asia, nationalisms in East Asia are very strong. However, they were also very strong in Europe before 1945. In particular, they are also still quite strong. Nationalism remains a very strong ideology, also in Europe, as we can see with the unfortunate rise of many right-wing parties in the European Union. But it is possible, the European Union showed, to go beyond that, to not just cooperate internationally within Europe, but actually create supranational institutions, make decisions together, not with your national hat on, not by representing your country, let's say in the European Parliament, which is one of the supranational organizations, institutions of the European Union, but rather where, you know, not the Germans sit together, but where the Social Democrats sit together, the Conservatives sit together, the Greens sit together from all the different countries. Even the nationalists sit together with the other nationalists of the other countries in the European Parliament. So that's what we would call kind of a supranational institution. Does that mean nationalism doesn't matter anymore? No, of course it still matters, but not as much as we might think, maybe. Patience and pragmatism, not lofty goals. Again, I'll explain what this means, but patience and pragmatism, I think, are very important. And historically, we can see this very clearly, that, you know, the European integration process is full of conflict, full of very slow progress. You know, not big progress towards big lofty ideals, but rather very small, pragmatic, muddling through, you could say. And sounds kind of negative, but that's what it is. But it worked somehow. And I mean, I don't want to be too optimistic. I later also talk about some of the negative aspects of this, of course, but and then I turn in my presentation to the lessons for Korean reunification. I would argue, or my hypothesis that I want to discuss with you is, it would actually, if you want to achieve a reunification in Korea, maybe you should talk less about reunification, but rather take a detour towards a much broader regional cooperation within East Asia, which then could enable in the long run a reunification. This is actually exactly what happened in Europe. The moment, and in the 80s, that was the moment where Germany became less obsessed, less focused, where domestic politics became less focused on reunification, where reunification was just one of the many goals to achieve. That's the moment when reunification actually happened. Not when everybody was talking about reunification, we need to have reunification, and that's the only goal, the most important goal, etc., etc. Anyway, I'll talk more about this later. I'm spending too much time on just the talking about what I want to talk about, but maybe then it will be quicker later. Finally, again, as I mentioned, we also shouldn't be too optimistic about this. I'll also highlight some aspects that might be not so favorable to regional cooperation in East Asia, and thus also Korean reunification. If you have the feeling that I want to talk about a lot of things, then that's true. And again, it's something I see as food for thought and getting into a discussion process with you, not in the sense that I kind of have a theory of European integration and its lessons for East Asia. I don't have a theory about this. I have some hypotheses that I would like to discuss with you. So, as you know, probably, and many of you who have studied European integration and international relations know that, you know, when we talk about realists in international relation, what we actually talk about is those who say, well, the reality of the international relations is that it's anarchic, that the only thing that, to put it shortly, that counts is power. Those who have the power, they will prevail. And they will kind of, as the world is a zero-sum game, so what one country gains relatively, another country loses relatively. And this is, of course, if you just listened to the Chinese Communist Party 100th anniversary, if you have listened to speeches of Donald Trump, and Biden is in this sense not much different, US President Biden, then of course you will always hear this kind of realist kind of underpinning of the way they think. What China gains, we lose. And the other way around, right? So I believe that this is not necessarily true. And again, let's discuss about this later. There is another interesting concept, of course, maybe you have heard about, which is the Thucydides trap, meaning basically, put it very simple, that rising powers like China will inevitably lead to conflict, and conflict in international relations ultimately often means war. In an anarchic system, rising power will always at some point, when it is powerful enough, challenge the hegemonic power and become maybe the new hegemonic power. And this is what, of course, created a lot of wars in Europe. Germany rising in the 19th century, early 20th century, challenging France and Great Britain and Russia, and so on. Yeah. However, I don't think that is really, a good way to look at this world. I'm not saying that, the realist approach doesn't help us it does provide us with some tools to understand some security conflicts. I absolutely agree. However, generally, as a worldview, I think it is extremely problematic, and it is also in many times it's also just simply wrong. So, for example, I believe that the European integration process is really not something you can understand from a realist perspective. So the EU shows that international cooperation and even, as I said, supranationalism works. In the end, anarchy, the realists that claim that it's all anarchic, it's just about power, is just what states made out of this. A famous quote by Wendt. So you can overcome this through cooperation, through building international institutions. You can overcome this kind of traps of international relations, the trap, the anarchy that there is no kind of global state who kind of hierarchically organizes everything. There are other forms of cooperation, not just hierarchical ones. This is something that realists don't fully understand, in my opinion. Rather, I think the realist kind of thinking is quite dangerous. Because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If leaders, if realists, let's say scholars, who have a realist perspective on analyzing international problems, if they inspire political leaders, then that is very problematic. Because then, of course, if you believe that China is just out there to challenge the US, and at some point even militarily challenge the US, then of course the US will react in a way that will also be more aggressive when it comes to armament, etc., etc. And we all know that arms races ultimately often lead to wars. And yeah, let me stop here. We can discuss all of these things more later. Most importantly, however, and I think this is something we can often see in East Asia much more clearly than in Europe, but in Europe that exists too. It's very easy for leaders to exploit, you know, the insecurity and the fear of other countries to legitimize their own power. And I think, I don't know if you have followed the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese President Xi Jinping very clearly said that actually during his speech, the time he got the most cheers was when he played the nationalist card, when he said, well, China is now so powerful that again, it will never ever, you know, let others bully us, oppress us, and enslave us. This is the point, the national, instill national pride and make people afraid of the enemies from the outside, and often imagined enemies, because I mean, who is there out there to enslave China? It's just not, it's a mirage. It doesn't exist. There is nobody out there to enslave China, right? But of course, looking at Chinese, it can only be understood by looking at Chinese history, the colonialism, the inferiority complex that evolved out of being colonized, has to be overcompensated with this kind of nationalist rhetoric. Anyway, let me move on. So I believe that at least when we look at the European integration process, a liberal institutionalist view is more informative, let's put it this way, or it's one of the more informative ways of looking at the European Union, where conflicts are actually seen as chances, as opportunities to work together, as opportunities to build institutions that can then, again, through a long process and slow process, lead to cooperation in other areas, to unintended consequences. The European integration process is actually full of these kind of unintended consequences, where cooperation in one area leads to cooperation in other areas that doesn't, originally not connected at all. So to very briefly, and I'm not telling you something new here, the European Union consists of 27 members, and it's characterized by very deep economic and institutional integration. And this is the difference, of course, to East Asia, where we have very strong economic integration, but only very weak political and institutional integration. I'll come back to this later. So regionalization and regionalism, I'm not sure if this was already discussed here too. Regionalization, economic, bottom-up investment. There's a lot of Korean investments, for example, in China. There's a lot of Korean investments in Southeast Asia, and Japanese and Chinese and so on. However, there are no institutions in East Asia that are, or I shouldn't say there are no institutions. There are institutions, but they're only weak institutions that could deal with conflicts that arise from this kind of economic integration. Trade conflicts, currency conflicts, etc., are usually not dealt with. Even if the institutions exist, they are weak or they don't work at all. So yeah, a very big difference there. EU institutions are very strong. There are every day there are dozens of meetings where on all levels of bureaucracy people meet from different member states in Brussels or at other places to discuss issues, and that makes a difference. Institutions in the meaning in the sense that you just meet very often, and these meetings and this kind of coordination, cooperation leads to many things. It leads to increased trust. It means, of course, to personal acquaintance too. It leads to better understanding of others. It leads to effects, you don't want to, if there's a goal set by the European Union, you don't want to justify yourself again and again and again at every meeting that you haven't done anything about this, etc., etc. This is institutions can mean a lot of things, right? So, but again, what I want to highlight here is that this is looking back at it historically, it worked out this way. However, as we all know, it remains precarious. Brexit was an example where relatively unexpectedly, I would say, a member state of the European Union, the UK, left through a referendum. And there are, of course, many other countries too, where, let's say, not everybody loves the European Union, right? In every country, there are opponents to this kind of integration process. Plus, it was really a very long and painful process, full of conflicts and crises. And this is, I think, something that is very important to understand. It's always something I always stress when I'm talking with my students about this, that, the time component is very important. This very, you don't overcome conflicts just by making signing a treaty. It takes time. It takes a lot of time, and you have to go solving crises together. This is something that helps further integration. I've already mentioned the kind of so-called functionalist spillovers, where cooperation in one area leads to cooperation in other areas. And the European Monetary Union and the whole process of European monetary integration is an example for that, because and again, I don't want to go too much into detail here, but when the Bretton Woods system, the global currency system, failed in the early 1970s, the European leaders sit together in the European communities and think, well, what are we doing now? Now that the global monetary system is gone, what are we going to do now? Are we going to have a market-based currency system? And very quickly, it became clear that that would not be really possible within the European Union, because then all the kind of different budgets and the fiscal policies within the European Union, the structural funds, the common agricultural policies, and all this would not work anymore. So that's when through all this kind of necessity, European first in the 1970s, the European exchange rate mechanism, and then later the European monetary system, etc. And then step by step, over 30 years, the European Monetary Union was completed. And of course, in many ways, the European Union is a complete unfinished business process. We all know the deficits of the European Union, and I'm not just because I'm not talking so much about them today doesn't mean they are not there. They are there, and the political union is quite weak still. There's this very strong democratic deficit within the European Union. The EU is still very much dominated by economic and by corporate interests. And it does not, let's say, while in many areas, usually in those areas where it's good for the companies, let's say when it comes to trade, when it comes to competition, the European Union is very active and very powerful. In trade, for example, the European Union has a sole decision-making power. There is no Korea-Germany trade agreement. There is an EU-Korea trade agreement. And the German government did not play any role in negotiating this treaty. That was completely just done by the European level. Of course, the German government, like all other governments, needed to, in the end, vote on it. That's true, but the whole process of negotiating it was done by the European Union. In other areas, when it comes to welfare, for example, the European Union is very weak. There is no social Europe yet. And there are like some discussion and some very, very small steps into that direction. But if we think about the nation state, what does the nation state do? And particularly in Europe do, but in Korea increasingly does so too, that is welfare. Welfare, of course, there's police, there's military, but welfare is like one of the most important roles of that state plays. In that area, the European Union is, I would say, almost non-existent. And that is a pity. I mean, there are other areas where the European Union doesn't matter that much, but where that's not a big deal. For example, when it comes to culture, the European Union doesn't play any important role. Cultural policies, education policies, the European Union doesn't play an important role, but doesn't matter. But in welfare, I think it does matter. Anyway, this is just a illustration of this very slow and process of taking one step up the ladder of economic and also political integration from the customs union in '58, and the step before, the PTA preferential trade agreement or economic partnership agreements, as they are now called. This is something the European Union was never. It was never a free trade area. It was started already as a customs union. So one common tariff to the outside world. Then we had, as I already mentioned, with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the European exchange rate mechanism, later European monetary system in 1979, single market 93, monetary union 99, and now the discussions are for the next steps, fiscal union. Increasing the budget of the European Union, which is now just about 1% of GDP in Europe, which is very, 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 very low. So fiscally, the European Union is not important at all. And then finally, the last step would be the political union. And we don't know if that step will ever come. I think we might also disagree if that's something that's desirable. And let's discuss this later. And just to highlight, when we think about East Asia, of course, where would be East Asia on this kind of, obviously very Eurocentric system of European integration? It would still be on the first step, which is the PTA, which is this trade agreement. Even that, the RCEP, I'll talk about it in a couple of slides, is not even ratified yet. We'll see what happens there. So it's not even, it's getting up the first step, let's put it this way. But as I already mentioned, economically, so it's not that, you know, there is no need for regional cooperation. I think there's a lot of need because there is a lot of economic activities going on. There's a lot of travel going on within East Asia. You know, economically, actually, East Asia is very integrated, and now including and more Southeast Asian countries get included into this kind of regional division of labor, I would say, with Japan being the first to outsource, to offshore production to China and to Southeast Asia, then Korea, and now more of the production is moving from China to Southeast Asia too. So I already mentioned this, the inevitable conflicts that arise from this kind of economic integration, if there are no institutions to deal with these conflicts, every single conflict is a big political issue. This is a question I think that should be addressed more in East Asia, and regional institutions can help, because then it's not just about, you know, Korea negotiating with China or Korea negotiating with Japan, but if you can kind of discuss this within regional institutions, it kind of takes the edge of the nationalist edge of the discussions, I would say. But anyway, let's yeah, so the question is that, you know, you have to ask yourself is, you know, do you want to kind of compete in the region by kind of winning nationalist zero-sum games, where like what you know, the market share that you take from Japan, or isn't it better to kind of cooperate by pooling resources? And this is what Zbigniew Brzezinski once said, you know, which, even though I'm not a big fan of him, I have to say, I think he put it quite nicely when it comes to East Asia, that East Asia, you know, has to make a choice. And this is, of course, problematic in itself, because how can East Asia or even a country make a choice? Oh, there's so much involved in this. But anyway, does East Asia want to repeat the European history of before 1914 or after 1945? And what he means with this is that before 1914, before World War I, Europe was very much integrated economically, but not institutionally. After 1945, with the European integration process, the economic integration and political cooperation, institutional cooperation went hand in hand. And this is what Brzezinski says. And I mean, here I agree with him. You know, this is what preserved peace in Europe. It's not, you know, this kind of liberal mantra, neoliberal mantra, you know, trade leads to peace. I think that's not true. Trade alone does not lead to peace. Actually, trade leads to conflicts. If you have the institutions to deal with this conflict, it can lead to peace. If you just try to exploit conflicts through nationalist rhetoric, trade and economic integration can actually lead to more conflicts and even military conflicts. Yeah, so maybe I can go through this quite quickly. There are, of course, have been many attempts of regional cooperation within East Asia. dominated really by bilateral relations. This is something I always find fascinating. You know, we just had the G7 summit in the UK, and all the leaders, including the Korean president, were there, even though Korea is not part of the G7, but they were invited as guests. However, even though you know, the G7 is a kind of multilateral informal institution, when I read about it in the newspaper here, what is talked about is usually kind of, okay, President Moon Jae-in of Korea met with German Chancellor Merkel, met with Biden, of course, most importantly, did not meet with the Japanese Prime Minister. So these are the news, you know, not what happened in the multilateral forum. It's not really that much reported. Only the bilateral forums are. So the focus is just very much on bilateralism. That's just what I wanted to mention. Yeah, so there are many ideas what could be done, you know, and right now, of course, the situation is particularly bad in East Asia when it comes to cooperation. It's really not that much going on. This was much better a few years back when we had, for example, the six-party talks to deal with the North Korea issue. But you know, looking at Europe, again, I think a lesson could be that, you know, such a ad hoc process of six-party talks needs to be, or should be, you know, this would be my hypothesis, would benefit from becoming a formal institutions like the CSCE in Europe that dealt with conflicts between countries, and even through the like coldest times of the Cold War, these kind of institutions worked, not by addressing kind of the main, you know, issues of Cold War confrontation, but rather by addressing other issues, cultural issues, but also human rights issues. And that kind of worked. Yeah, so again, yeah, disarmament, this was also very important. So, you know, yeah, anyway, I think I need to move a little bit faster. I have already like almost spoken for almost 50 minutes. So let me go directly to the next step. As I mentioned, the most recent attempt of regional cooperation within East Asia, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, we were signed in 2020, which would become the world's largest economic region. It would be bigger than the European Union. And it has includes not just, and is meaningful because it, for the first time, it has a comprehensive trade agreement between Japan, Korea, and China, so the biggest economies in the region. Will also include the ASEAN countries and Australia and New Zealand. However, it does exclude North Korea. It also is not as comprehensive, you know, when it says regional comprehensive economic partnership, it sounds that it's very comprehensive. Actually, compared to the European Union, compared also to, let's say, for example, the EU-Korea free trade agreement, which is just celebrated its 10th anniversary, it's much less comprehensive. And it does not, for example, include protection of labor, human rights, and the environment. There are, of course, other institutions like the Chiang Mai initiative. I don't know if you heard about this. I've done some research on this many years back, so we can also talk more about this monetary cooperation within the East Asian region, set up after the Asian financial crisis of 97 and 98. Good idea, but it didn't work. And it was not activated, for example, during the world economic crisis, world financial crisis of 2008, even though East Asia was very much affected by it, it didn't work. Instead, Korea and all the other countries in the region went to the US to secure bilateral support and did not go to its partner countries within the East Asian region, but rather to the US. Anyway, well, if there's questions later about Chiang Mai Initiative, I can talk about this. So should I talk about Supranationalism? Maybe I skip this because I'm just seeing full of shock that it's already 10 minutes to 7 here in Korea. So let me maybe skip this part of supranationalism and just mention that this is really the unique thing about, you know, the European Union, that the European Union is not just an international organization. It is a hybrid between an international organization and a federal state. I would say this would be my kind of my hypothesis. There are others who say, and this, you will not find anybody within the European hierarchies in the European bureaucracy or any political decision maker who will say that the European Union is becoming a federal state. But in many ways, you know, if you look at the institutions, they are very similar. You have the European Commission, which is basically the government. You have the European Parliament. You have the European Council of Ministers, which would be something like the US Senate, where the member states are represented. In the US, they are represented through the senators directly elected. In the European Union, they are represented by their representatives from their government. And this is, again, one of the big differences between East Asia, ASEAN, other regional institutions, that they don't have that kind of element. Their degree of integration is much more shallow. The decision-making process is also different because in the European Union, decisions are made by a qualified majority. Most decisions are made by a qualified majority, not by consensus or by unanimous vote. And that is different in most of the regional cooperation that is going on in East Asia. Okay, let me talk about conflict, patience, and pragmatism. Already mentioned, you know, not full of crisis, the European integration process, not harmony. You know, this is often, you know, something that I encounter here when I talk about the European integration process. Yeah, you can't compare Europe with East Asia because, you know, first of all, Europeans, they are much more kind of similar, which is not true. You know, there are much more harmonious relations in Europe, also not true, particularly not historically, but not harmony, but a goodwill to solve crisis together was, I think, and to react to crisis with more integration. And this is, I think, what we have been seeing throughout. And of course, every crisis brings up the question, will we see more, including the current Corona crisis, will we see more European integration? Or will we see kind of the European Union drifting apart? If history is a lesson, then also this crisis will lead to more integration, and which would make sense because health was actually one of the areas where the European Union was very weak. It was nation states who made the decisions, and often they made the decisions very badly compared to Korea. You know, Korea was, okay, I don't want to open another can of worms here, but you know, the European Union did not have much to say in the Corona situation. So I'm sure in the future, health will be much more a topic within the European Union itself, and the European Union will get more competences. The European Commission will get more competences in that area. So, and patience is needed, particularly when it comes to the very contentious issues. And of course, East Asia is full of contentious issues, trade conflicts, territorial disputes, historical disputes. And the same was true in Europe, and took a very long time for these to not resolved. They are not resolved now. They still exist. They are not just, but they are not used as a hindrance for cooperation. And I just, as an example, I want to bring here the German guilt of kind of the aggression of World War II, which took a very, very long time in Germany to come to terms with. It took a very long time until Germany apologized to the countries that suffered from German aggression. It took a very long time until actually Richard von Weizsäcker, then German president in 1985, I can still remember this, I was in school then, who for the first time said something that is nowadays in Germany common sense, that Germany was liberated in 1945 from fascism. You know? So that the 1945, the end of World War II, was a liberation for Germany from fascism. It was not a defeat. At that time, that was a big scandal. In 1985, there were many who criticized them. Well, how can you say something like that? It was not a liberation. But yeah, anyway, I'm just saying that, and particularly German Conservative Party was, you know, very almost against everything. And I constantly get reminded of this in Korea, because in Korea it's the same. The Korean Conservative Party just against anything, you know, any kind of talk with North Korea, any kind of reconciliation with North Korea, with China, etc. And it was for a very long time, this was very similar in Germany to the so-called Ostpolitik you heard about probably by Willy Brandt. The Conservative Party fought it all the way. I just have to one poster from the election in 1980 of the German Conservative Party called CDU, where they say basically, where they still laid claim on that the German question is not just about reunification, it also includes all the lost territories during World War II. So you can see here that, you know, there was very much territorial conflicts going on, and very much you know, opposition to any kind of reconciliation with East Germany and the Soviet Union and the whole Eastern European bloc. Okay, I have to go through this a little bit quicker. So I would say, you know, many conflicts actually cannot be solved, or maybe don't need to be solved. So for example, whenever, you know, North Korea, the North Korea issue comes up, of course, the nuclear weapon issue comes up. Is that a realistic, and again, let's discuss this later, is that some realistic demand, you know, to tell North Korea before we kind of talk with you or negotiate with you, you need to give up your nuclear weapons? Of course, no, that's not. Or because before we lift the sanctions, you need to give up your nuclear weapons. This is not going to. The important thing is not and that might be very controversial, but the important issue is not, doesn't North Korea have nuclear weapons? The important issue is, are we able to preserve peace on the Korean Peninsula, from my perspective? Again, territorial disputes, this would be even more controversial, I guess, in Korea. Territorial disputes in East Asia. There are many. And of course, for Korean, the most burning one is Tokdo, an island also claimed by Japan, but controlled by Korea. And it is a very, very big issue in Korea, a very nationalist, very emotional issue. Where I would always say that, why does it have to be such an emotional issue? Because Korea does control Tokdo, and there is no legitimate claim from Japan at all. They just, claim this. To be honest, I don't even know exactly, to rally their own kind of nationalist basis. They claim that, Tokdo is Japanese, even though there is no, Korea controls it, and there is no kind of really basis for that claim. So a lot of emotional issues where, when I now name some of the territorial disputes within the European Union, you probably have never heard about them. And that's not because they don't exist. That's because nobody talks about them, because they don't matter that much. But Gibraltar, at least before the UK went, Mont Blanc, Baltic Sea, and there are many. These are just the big ones where there are territorial disputes within the European Union. The important thing is that to not let these conflicts escalate, but not to solve these conflicts, really, in the sense that so this is what I mean with kind of pragmatism. And my fear is, and I think what you can clearly observe in East Asia, but also in Europe, of course, is that these issues are exploited by nationalist leaders to stir up emotions, to win elections. For that reason, by stirring up emotions, because that's the easiest way to win elections, right? You don't have to have a program. You don't need to kind of think about a political philosophy. You can just kind of stir up, the nationalist emotions against country A, country B, etc., etc. Anyway, I'm kind of probably going over this much too fast, but I want to leave more time for questions. This is just one example of another, territorial conflict you have never heard about, and that is one between Germany and the Netherlands, and it is about the Ems Delta, where Germany and Netherlands disagree about the border. I don't know if you can see the Netherlands believes that says the border is in the middle of the river, and Germany says no, the border is actually directly at the kind of Dutch shore. And both have kind of reasons. Germany says, well, this was decided in the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and there's a property title by, etc., etc. Many historical reasons. Often you hear about these in East Asia too. Do they matter? No and yes. Does this territorial conflict matter? No and yes. No, because it doesn't. Because with the EU, with the Schengen area, there is no real border anyway between Netherlands and Germany. There's no border control, so it doesn't really matter where the border is. But of course, if you want to, when you think about kind of bureaucracy, then it matters too. Then it does matter, because when an offshore wind park was created in that particular area, it was, of course, the builder of this offshore wind park needed to get an approval. So do you get now the approval from the German government, or rather the government of that German state, or do you need it from the Netherlands? So then suddenly these kind of things matter. And that's the only time we hear about these kind of conflicts. What was done, again, I would say pragmatically, you make a treaty about the economic use of that area. What was not decided, where is the border? So the border dispute exists. There's still different border issues. There's a territorial dispute between Germany and Netherlands. It was not solved. but the economic use of that area was solved. It's just one example, what I would say is an example for such pragmatic solutions. Yeah, this also something I mentioned in the beginning. Interestingly, German reunification happened when we stopped talking about German reunification in the 1980s. Not stopped, but suddenly it became less of an issue, and particularly among the younger generation, and I was among the very young generation at that point. It was not an issue at all, right? Even for my parents' generation, it was not such a super important issue. But in the 80s, you know, it wouldn't, you know, parties wouldn't run on a reunification platform in elections, just to give an example. This is, of course, very different from Korea, where reunification is really that most important issue. And that's actually, it's the issue where the conservative, or the so-called conservative party, and the so-called liberal party in Korea differ, because in many other areas they don't differ that much. You know, they don't have such a big difference in their political platforms. But the difference is their attitude towards North Korea, towards China, and the US. That's the difference. So, yeah, so, and I would say that, you know, the many factors, of course, were there about reunification. You have been discussing about, you know, of course, the East Germans demanded for democracy. We are the people. You know, they wanted, they were not dissatisfied, they were not satisfied with the economic situation in East Europe. There was a kind of common peace movement, which is, I think, quite interesting too, in Western and Germany and Eastern Germany. At the same time, in the 60s and 70s, a peace movement against armament emerged, and they worked together. You know, they cooperated with each other. And this is, I think, the way of, you know, a very low level kind of cooperation between East and West that was made possible through the Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik. That kind of led to this kind of ultimately kind of resulted in reunification by normal people cooperating with each other, not just governments, right, across border. And this is, of course, something that is right now inconceivable in Korea. I mean, in South Korea, we can't even get North Korean TV or radio, right? Not to mention travel there or call people in North Korea. It's not possible. It's actually forbidden, not by North Korea, but by South Korea. So the exchange, the amount of exchange is just not comparable. It's very low, and this is something where I think one could start by bringing together people, civil society groups, and not just governments. Universities, education, you know, bringing together students from North and South. This would be something that would be very meaningful. Probably not in political science and social science first, but in other areas like natural sciences, this would be probably a good start. But there are many, again, and I'm rushing ahead here a little bit too fast, but I'm running out of time. But I believe that, you know, why in the end the reunification, you know, went relatively smoothly, even though there are many problems. Again, you hear about that too. Was very costly, etc., and was not dealt, in many ways, it was not dealt with very well. But at least initially, you know, the attractiveness of West Germany, the attractiveness of the social democratic model of the social market economy. This is what Germans are extremely proud of. This was the kind of an attractiveness that made kind of the reunification with Germany from the Eastern perspective quite appealing. The attractiveness of being integrated into the West, into not just Germany, but into the whole kind of Western European community, single market, etc., was of course also something that was very appealing economically. And this is what I would say, this is something that Korea can also work on, you know, making South Korea more attractive, you know, that, you know, ultimately more attractive for North Koreans to want reunification, to build a bigger, like, kind of East Asian community, East Asian regional community, in which, you know, the conflict between the North and the South would kind of could be mitigated, and you could take off the edge of these conflicts that become more clear in the bilateral negotiations than in the multilateral ones. Yeah, this is just the peace movement, East and West. So this is basically what I said, you know, building an attractive country and an attractive region that North Korea wants to join. Also, of course, integrate North Korea into regional institutions if possible. You know, the RCEP, as I said, North Korea is not included. China is included. South Korea, Japan is included. North Korea is not included. This is something important, you know, to always think about North Korea too when negotiating these kind of treaties. So set the stage for reunification, but not, you know, like, and then patiently wait for the historical opportunity to achieve it. I think this is that was the key to German reunification, and maybe could be important, could be something to think about for South Korea. And I'm not in the position here to give kind of advice to Koreans or the Korean government. They've also not really asked me for that kind of advice. But this is something that I think we should discuss, that we should discuss in this summer school, and this is something we should discuss more broadly in the society. Yeah, I mean, just a very last point I want to make. Why do I believe that, you know, there are also many problems with East Asian regional cooperation? I see most of the problems are actually in the way the East Asian, this is actually more my area of expertise, more my area of let's say my area of research, where I did not just do teaching, but where I do research, this East Asian development model, which is based on the one hand, on kind of regional production within East Asia, but also selling, you know, the products that are made in East Asia in the markets abroad. You know, so East Asian countries compete against each other to export to markets all over the world, but they do not primarily sell in the East Asian market, because there is no single East Asian market. You know, so for example, you'll find a lot of Japanese cars and Korean cars in Germany, but you will not find many Japanese cars in Korea and many Korean cars in Japan. This is just very simple what I want to say. So, and this, of course, this competition, economic competition within East Asia, no existing single common market, that makes it difficult. So So I do believe that through economic cooperation, you know, progress can come, cooperation can come, but it's not the only thing. So yeah, I don't need to summarize the argument. I think you got it, and it's not, you know, I made a lot of points. I apologize for this. If there's something you want me to focus more on, then please, you know, let me know. And if you have any questions, now is the time.